Welcome to Shorty's SuperCoach, and today we're going to have a bit of a chat about the midfield and what sort of structure you should be going for in 2016, and just discuss a few options that I think are really what I look for when picking my midfield, and a few guidelines I think are always important to follow. First things first, the midfield is the most important thing you have to nail. There's always a bit of uncertainty about defenders and forwards to a lesser extent, and the rucks, secondly, that second ruck I should say, can be tricky at times, but the midfield you must get right. The most points is to be made there, as is the most amount of cash to also be made there, so you can't afford to have too many wrong picks in your midfield if you want to make that top 1,000. I think when picking midfielders, that top end, you really have to pay money obviously to get the very best, and there's certain ones that you should always lock in from the start, and there's always even a bit of value at around 500, 550k. Often value is associated with players like Liberatore, who's about 357, but even someone like Tommy Rockcliffe, who's 550, he's well unders due to injury. Luke Parker, due to injury, is definitely unders. Joel Selwood is, he's a bit down. I know you won't be picking him because he's a bit injured at the moment, but there are players that, despite their price tag, Dylan Shields, another one. Bit of injury, bit of a sub-affected sort of score. So it may only be minimal, but that extra 40, 50k for certain points they lost by only playing half a match last year, that can be really valuable if you get a couple of those sort of minor value picks in the midfield. But I will say, I've got a couple of those, but I think this year, more than most others, is where you should really be picking real amounts of coin in the midfield. I can see a lot of money being spent through that midfield this year, mainly because of this trio: Liberatore, Jaeger O'Meara, and Brad Crouch. I think all those guys offer great value, and it's hard to say no to any of them. I think you almost have to have all three, because barring any mishaps through the pre-season, they should all average 95 plus, guaranteed. So that's being conservative. I can see them easily going 3 figures and beyond, which would be absolutely fantastic for us. So I think, barring any midfield mishaps for them, you should lock them in. Now, when picking my absolute premiums, I must say the midfield can be a two-edged sword at times, because you have the most points to be scored in the midfield, which is tempting to load it up. But by the same token, there's more top-end players that are there to pick from. So by what I mean from that, there's more guns that are potentially top 12 mids by the end of the year, which is sort of the bracket I look to go. Ideally you pick the top 8, but that's pretty impossible when you really think about it. So go for the top 12 averages. And by meaning that, there's guys that are priced around 500 to 600 at the moment who may just have a slowish start. So there's more guys to pounce on, is what I mean. So you may hold back. And then again, to that, following that train of thought, there's often historically more rookie price players that get more game time and score better points to the midfield. So it's a fine balance. It's like, do I go big and lock in some real points and potentially miss out on a slider who, Joel Selwood gets concussed in round 4 or something and I miss out on him, or Matty Pritis has a slight tweak of something, gets subbed off early, being cautious, and I can't pick him up because I've gone so heavy in the midfield and missed a mid-season bargain. Do I cash in on some mid-price players that I talked about before? I think this year, as I said, will be where the money is really spent in the midfield for that trio. I know I'll be spending, I think at the moment, Crouch or O'Meara, whichever one you want to value at least, is definitely going to be my M7, potentially M8, depending on other structures and how confident I am in other players on the ground. I'll talk about some actual guidelines when picking premium midfielders. I think not enough time is put into picking your premiums. You just see them, they've averaged 100 plus so many years, you lock them in. But be careful, try to really pick a player who's still in his prime, in his peak, and is not going to drop off. I know that sounds obvious, but often you'll see players who average 111 and they drop back to 106. Now that's nice, 106 is nice, but ideally you want the guy to be averaging and be priced at what you feel is a minimum output, and really get that, lock him in, and you should be getting extra points, hopefully. I mean, you want to get a player who's in his peak, still rising in the absolute prime of his career. So I think that's worth noting. Don't just throw big cash around on a guy who, potentially is heading into the twilight of his career. He's been great for so long. I mean, you could put a Jobe Watts in that category in past years and, just slightly dropping off. I think there's some midfielders that you just lock in. I talked about potential sliders. There's some guys who just are not going to slide, barring injury, but even then, they never get injured really. Scott Pendlebury is the absolute real player to talk about when we speak of that. In the past, I've gone, oh geez, he's pretty expensive, I might look to pick him up, and that has proven to be a near impossible task using just one trade to downgrade and then get him, because he just doesn't produce under 80s enough, which is great for picking him, but if you're trying to snap him up mid through the season, he just doesn't produce enough 3 rounds in a row for his price to continually drop. So there's players like that I think you just lock him in, you pay the big money. You'll be paying big money for Abbott, you'll be paying big money for Pendlebury, and I think that's wise choices. I will say steer clear of Nat Fyfe, I must say, for this season. Obviously not down the track, but I think for our starting squads, he's priced so highly, he's having on lighter duties in the pre-season so far, so tread with caution there, I think. I should get back to the guidelines when picking premium midfielders. Keep it simple, I think. You've got to ask yourself, are they going to average 105 plus? That's my cautious sort of price range. I think if we want to get greedy, and I think you've got to be greedy in the midfield, I want 110 average from my players. I think that's where you really want to rank it at, because our very, very top mids, they'll average 115 plus, and you want to have a few of them. But I think that sort of bottom 4 midfielders placings come season's end, if you can get them averaging 110 plus, that is pure gold. So for me, I look for 110 plus. I think you'd take, I mean, it's a fine line. 105, I'm probably not super happy with, but you take it, and then you only throw on a few points per game. I know it's not much, but it can make the difference in the rankings. You know, if they average 108, 109, that's a pretty good season. I think you take that. So as far as guidelines, there's some players that you just lock in from the start. There's others you might feel you're a bit better chance by their scoring nature to pick them up later in the season, or given their pre-season, they may be tracking along slowly and you feel like you might be able to snap them up. But I think it's a fine line between having enough gun rookies, the rookies you must have, and those absolute players that offer real value in the midfield and can score you big points. But personally this season, I'll be looking for big points to the midfield, spending plenty of cash in there, and that's not going overboard. I mean, you'll get O'Meara, Libba and Crouch for what, about $1 million? I mean, that's unbelievable, because there'll be probably next year or the year after, you'll have to pay, you know, at least $1.5 million for them down the track. So they're priced bargain basement, so for what they're capable of. But I think that's the main thing you want to look at. Be greedy in the midfield, 110 plus for sure. And when you're picking those sort of rookie players, as I've said in other videos, NAB Challenge will decide them. It's hard to really talk about them at the moment, but I think find 3 or 4, because they often and historically will generate the most cash and have the most scoring ability, which is great when picking guys around that 110 to 130k. So as I said, it's a bit of a balancing act, but I'll be more inclined to rack up, just place in Ablett, Libba, O'Meara, Crouch for sure, and see what else sort of works out from there. Probably another premium, absolute top end premium alongside Ablett. As I said, I'm not picking your team, pick it yourself, because you got to have individual teams, but I think those 4 guys in particular are almost lock-ins, and you can build a team around because they add value and you can just about bank on them, barring any sort of pre-season injuries. So that's a bit of a wrap of what I look for in the midfield. Obviously, it's the most important position, as I said, because it generates the most points and the most cash. So be careful. Don't just throw that cash around, because as I've talked about, it's like a stock. You want your stock to rise, and you do not want to fork out big amount of coin and then to be let down, and all of a sudden they're sliding and they're losing value and they're not scoring your points. So be extremely careful, and I'll be looking at the rucks next, so stay tuned for that. If you liked the video, give it a like, give it a comment. If you've got any feedback on what you look for in the midfield, or any gems that you think I've missed or I haven't talked about that you're locking in your side, and certainly give the channel a subscribe, because that's super important. And yeah, stay tuned, because there'll be plenty more SuperCoach content coming your way.